Midnight on Earth podcast with your host, Jake Weaver. Engineered by Cedric Swan. Hey everybody, we're back with another episode of Midnight on Earth. I'm your host, Jake Weaver, and we're here to bring you more knowledge, more light, and more love. Well, we have another legend on the show. I'm always so excited when we have these legendary humans that have contributed so much. I mean, every human has contributed so much, but there's these people, these humans that have invested so much of their living life energy into helping humanity evolve. And I have one of those people on the show today, Jill Purce. I'm so excited she's here. We're going to talk to her. But first, I need you to do something for me. Go to bluecobracbd.com. That's bluecobracbd.com. And there you will find Blue Cobra CBD oil, the highest quality CBD oil available on the market, period. Absolutely, period. The reason this is because this product has a proprietary extraction method. It is called the HIT extraction method. So to get the CBD out of the cannabis, it needs to be extracted in a certain way. He developed his own way that no one else has. There's no chemicals, no solvents, no gases are used to extract that CBD. It's all natural. And it's 100% Oregon-grown organic hemp that is used for the oil, which is 100% organic. A lot of 100% going on when I talk about this. It's 100% amazing. I'm not even joking. I take it every day. There might be a day where I forget, and then I'm like, why am I feeling weird? Because it helps stabilize me. To be completely honest, the CBD, it makes me feel so in tune with nature. People that ingest cannabis, of course, the entourage effect is in place. It just gets activated more. And guess what, people? We have a Blue Cobra CBD Midnight on Earth discount code. And that is MIDCBD. MIDCBD. That's the discount code. You put that into the discount code box at checkout and you will receive free shipping on any order in the continental 48 United States. Everywhere else, it's still available. International listeners, please check with your country's regulations and laws. If you have any questions, contact Howard Hint directly at his website, bluecobracbd.com. In the contact section, he'll tell you. He loves to talk about this stuff. It's his passion. It's a family business. It's his family, his wife, Judy, their whole family. They're amazing people. And there is a money back guarantee policy, meaning for some reason you don't like it, you keep the product, you get all your money back. If you had to pay shipping, you get that back too. Give it to someone else. It's totally legal in America, in all 50 states and all the territories related to America and American laws. 100% legal. You can put it on your body, in your body. And now, of course, there's the King Cobra, the ultimate extra strength version of what was there before. And then there is Little King Cobra, which is the previous generation of Blue Cobra CBD. We are now in Blue Cobra CBD, the next generation. Pet products now. Remember I was talking about this forever? It's there now. For pets, 100% pet safe. It is called Wild Thing. You can find all that at bluecobracbd.com. So please go there, check it out. bluecobracbd.com. That is bluecobracbd.com. And when you're done with that, follow me on Instagram at Midnight _on_earth. That is the address. You can follow me there. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you go to get your podcasts, click the button that connects us so you know when these guests come on with their incredible information, these topics you need to know about it. Click that button. And of course, the most important thing is to tell a friend. Tell someone that you know that loves these type of podcasts that would love to hear about what Jill Purce is bringing to the table, ancestral family healing. So much she's contributed. You want them to know about this. Tell them. It's up to you. midnightonearth.com. Okay, well, we're going to talk to Jill Purce in just a second, but of course, as usual, we always read our guest bio. So here we go. Jill Purce is a British voice teacher, family constellations therapist, and author. In the 1970s, Purce developed a new way of working with the voice, introducing the teaching of group overtone chanting, which is producing a single note while amplifying the vocal harmonics. Jill pioneered the international sound healing movement through her rediscovery of ancient vocal techniques, the teaching of overtone chanting, the power of group chant, and the spiritual potential of the voice as a magical instrument for healing and meditation. Cool. She pioneered the practice of healing family and ancestral traumas and the activation of the mandala as a living practice with her extended mandala ceremonies. Her 1974 book about the spiral in sacred traditions, art, and psychology, called The Mystic Spiral Journey of the Soul, is considered a spiritual and metaphysical classic, and I highly recommend it. Jill has been following the philosophy and practice of Dzogchen since 1978, when she started working with the Tibetan Lama Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche. After her postgraduate fellowship in the biophysics department at King's College London, working with Maurice Wilkins, who received a Nobel Prize for DNA, with whom she dialogued on the relationship between art, science, and spirituality, she lived and worked in Kirton with German composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, exploring the spiritual dimension of music. She learned overtone chanting in the Himalayas with the chant master of the Kyoto Tibetan monastery. Jill has taught the English National Opera and the English Shakespeare Company, as well as teaching in hospitals, schools, monastic communities, and businesses. She lectures and conducts workshops internationally, especially the healing voice, exploring diverse forms of spiritual chant and guiding non-singers and singers in their pursuit of the lost voice. She produced over 30 books as general editor of the Thames and Hudson Art and Imagination series, which was a series that pioneered a thematic approach to the spiritual and psychological meanings of the art of different cultures. And she's here now with us in 2022, so graciously and so generously. Jill Purce, thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a delight. Thank you.
What a contribution. What a bio. You've had such an incredible life. I mean, this is an incredible honor for me because I first heard about you when I was a younger guy, first trying to raise my awareness of spiritual and psychedelic things, and came across a VHS copy of Prognosis with Terence McKenna. And in that VHS, you were one of the featured guests at the end, where you did some of your overtone chanting in a beautiful part of Amsterdam, I believe. So since then, I've been fully aware of you, and I just really appreciate all the work you've done. But as a spiritual person, when did your first activation experience happen? When did you first become aware that you were this spiritual being?
Oh my goodness, what a question. Well, just a correction, actually. The thing with Terence was in Prague. It was
Prague. Excuse me.
Prague.
I'm sorry. My memory's a little fuzzy there.
Hence prognosis. Yeah.
Oh, right. Of course.
Yeah. No, Terence was a very good friend of me and my husband Rupert Sheldrake. So we spent a lot of time with him, and we miss him sorely. But I first became aware. Well, as a really young child, I think, I was always very interested in the bigger picture. And perhaps one of the most, one of the most significant effects, I had a very eccentric family. And my father in particular, he was a surgeon, but he loved to kind of pull the house down and do all kinds of things. I think surgeons like doing things with pipes, whether they're pipes inside the body or pipes inside the house. Anyway, he was one for pipes and water and flow. And so on one occasion we used to spend he comes from Northern Ireland, and we used to spend our summers in Ireland. And on one occasion, we went to visit. We were staying in County Mayo, and we went to visit an island called Inishturk, which was a long way, at least over an hour away. And being like my father, we started in the middle of the night. Most people had gone to bed, but we started. So it was just my brother and my father and mother and I, and three women going home to their island. And as we left, a storm blew up, a violent storm. And I was we were all absolutely terrified because we knew we were going to drown. And then all of a sudden, these three women dressed in black, standing at the back of the boat, started a kind of wailing, crying sound, chanting, the most extraordinary spine-chilling sound, which in that moment turned our terror into a kind of ecstasy, into a kind of bliss. And the wind subsided and the storm abated, and we arrived. So that was my first induction into the power of sound, just not only as a transformation of our emotions, but also of the elements themselves. And I must have been around 7 at the time. So I would say that was the first experience of certainly the power of sound, the power of vocal sound.
And you felt that as a healing experience because you had the tension, like you said, the anxiety of being in that situation, and that brought you back into your body, you would say?
It made me realize that, I went from terror to ecstasy into bliss. And so I realized, how sound could bring about such fundamental changes, internal changes, but also not just internal changes, but external. It transformed the elements, the weather itself. So I think what I got there was the power of sound, the power of the vocal sound, as a extraordinary transformative tool, both spiritually and physically and emotionally.
So you had that experience, but that was at 7 years old. There had to be further experiences then that helped nurture that understanding and also that perspective.
Yeah, I think all along I was, aware and of certain, a prescience, knowing the things that were going to happen, and knowing, finding that I had some kind of healing ability and all that. That just gradually I became gradually aware of that, and then started teaching. With working with sound and exploring the spiral and all kinds of connections. I think it was, and also the power, also water. I had many experiences with water and noticed these patterns. You mentioned my book, The Mystic Spiral. Well, I think my first awareness of the spiral became when I was at school. I was standing. There's a place, I was at school in Oxford. I was at a girls' boarding school, and we used to go out, and there was a place on the river where the weir stopped the flow of water, and I could see how the blockage of the water allowed the water to turn back on itself and create spiral eddies. And in this moment, I realized the creative power of water once it's resisted, or the flow of it is resisted, how form is created. And so I was very, very interested in the coming into being of form as well. So it wasn't just a spiritual awakening, but it was a awakening of an interest of very fundamental principles of nature, of how form comes into being, how creativity happens, and all of that together, really.
Yes, those three things, it seems: your experience with water, your experience with sound, and then you're saying you were already an intuitive, psychic, energy sensitive person. This sound technique and what you're teaching people with ancestral healing, this is just your conduit. It's just your focus. But really, exactly. Overall, you're still this incredibly intuitive, psychic, energy sensitive person. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, it would seem so. People people find, that whatever I do, that it tends to change their life and heal them and bring about things that they aspire to. And, I mean, I don't like making claims, but this is certainly the reaction of people who I encounter.
Well, that's amazing. You do have an incredibly infectious vibe. Your energy field is just really positive and loving. But you notice this spiral in the water. We can talk about the spiral a little bit. This is something that has shown up throughout history. And in your book, you traced it back even all the way to the Stone Age and before the Stone Age. It's this universal cosmic symbol. What do you think this represents, this spiral?
Well, I think it represents so much. I mean, as I said earlier, it's really, a record of in space and time of growth. Like when you see a shell, it's a record of its growth in time. So you find in nature that's very much what it is. But it's very much to do with our aspiration. The rotational path from Earth to heaven, if you like, or the divine. So, where you circle around and you keep meeting yourself, but on a higher plane. So it's not the eternal dull round, but it's a kind of circular path with progression. So it tends to be an aspirational journey, a journey of the soul, which is what I, made the subtitle of the book that I wrote.
Right.
And it has to do with the energies of the body, Kundalini, the inner energies of the body are described as sort of rotation, described an experience as sort of rotating up and down the body. And then you mentioned Maurice Wilkins. I worked, in the early 70s, I did a research fellowship at King's College with Maurice Wilkins, who was Watson and Crick got the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA. But he was always very scathing about the spiral of DNA because he said it was a helix, not a spiral. And that's a very interesting distinction because a helix, the diameter doesn't change, whereas a spiral, the key thing about the spiral is the diameter changes. So, it's either getting wider or getting smaller. But it's a kind of dynamic. It's very much. You see it in the growth of plants and in the geometry of all kinds of aspects of nature. It's a very, very, and now, with all it's in the latest mathematics. And I mean, when I wrote my book, my book was always meant to be a sort of the spiritual aspect, whereas my original idea was to show how the spiral in nature and the spiral of our spiritual journey and how all these things connect. And so much of the scientific side has become more significant since I was working on it. It's very much represents, chaos theory. I mean, it's so much now of dynamics. The whole dynamic theories of everything is in vibration, rotation, and it's completely fundamental in nature.
Right. I did notice that the spiral and what that represents has been, since you wrote that book, it's been adapted more and more into mainstream thinking. You're seeing these mathematics, these geometrical patterns show up in such a way that the recognition is happening of this sacred geometry in all sectors of mainstream thinking. These concepts that we're talking about, geometry and nature, were considered once abstract, but now mainstream. And also you're saying, Jill, that it always seems to archetypally represent forward growth, progression, movement upward. That seems to be the underlying symbol of the spiral. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, I mean, you could say there are descending vortices like whirlpools and so on, but in general, it's you in general you find it as a very positive symbol of growth and development.
So if a person sees that symbol in their life, should they take it as a synchronistic symbol of growth in their lives, like some sort of communication?
I think so. I mean, it's very similar to the labyrinth pattern or mandala patterns, which are all patterns of a kind of rotational journey towards the center, towards unity. The labyrinth is a kind of oscillatory, very interesting oscillatory spiral where you're going backwards and forwards, and then just when you think you've got to the center, you're actually thrust to the outside again, and then finally you hurry into the center. So in the labyrinth is a very is a form of the spiral journey. So it occurs in many forms. And
again, you also said that it represents the hero's journey, right? Which is discovering oneself, discovering one's true self, and knowing yourself, and then becoming a more enlightened being. It's the road to enlightenment, you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the Tibetan tradition, the mandala, which I spent many years working, embodying the mandala. So the mandala is a very multi-symbolic representation of consciousness. In Tibetan Buddhism, it's incredibly profound. And so what interested me, having spent many years studying Tibetan Buddhism, was to actually embody the spiral, so that when I have large groups, I spend several of these. I mean, I've done about 30 now. Until the pandemic, I was doing 2 a year. And so with about sort of 100 people, where the people become the mandala, and we through the week, we progress through it's a spiral journey within the 4 directions within the mandala, and we end up having been in every single position within that at the end of the week, having related to different people opposite us, working with afflictive emotions and understanding the transformation into wisdom. So again, it's the kind of journey into the center. But once you're in the center, like as with the labyrinth, you can't stay in the center. As with the in the mandala and the labyrinth, you have to come out to everyday life again. That's really important. Having sort of understood the wisdom of unity, you then have to operate in the outside world. So the journey in the labyrinth, it takes you out again to the outside world, so that you transform the outside world with the understanding of the center.
Yes, that's what I was going to ask you, is you then go back into your life with this new understanding, your relationships, your work relationship, and you try to elevate, right? You try to help people get to that same place you are by just radiating that frequency.
Yes, I mean it just happens. Once you've been in the center, then you're different, and so people automatically resonate with you as a different being.
Right. Isn't that interesting? What do you think, just on this topic, what do you think about the theory that if enough people get to that center place and they radiate a certain frequency, that we can lift the collective frequency of humanity to that higher place? Is that something you believe?
Well, I don't think there's a particular point. This was a point made by Lyle Watson. He gave a story, having read my husband Rupert Sheldrake's book, and he talked about the 100th monkey.
Yes!
Where when so many monkeys,
yes!
have washed their potatoes, then everybody starts doing. So this was a misreading of my husband's theory. There isn't a particular point at which everybody starts doing it, but the more people who do it, the more people who do it.
But is there an attractive force, though, much like resonant fields, that as the person is attracted to your field and then they start to sync up with it with their own choices and behaviors, isn't that then the same thing?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the more people who have a deep understanding and who are present, obviously the people who come into contact with them, they resonate with you. I mean, it's very interesting how that happens. I remember many years ago, I was in a mystical bookshop, And because I suppose I have this ability or somewhere in. I don't like talking about these things. Anyway,
oh, you're wonderful. I love you. Thank you.
Anyway, there was a man standing there looking at books, and I just felt this, it was very sort of Gajifian, it was very Sufi. I felt this very strong kind of sense of oneness with this person, and then I discovered who he was, and that actually he was a practicing Sufi. So I think, you recognize there's a kind of resonance that happens with people, and once you make these changes, people resonate with you. I mean, that's what happens. You resonate with other people that you hang out with. I mean, I remember once I had a very fun experience. When Rupert and I got married, the photographer at our wedding was, he knew me. He wasn't a wedding photographer. In fact, he was a Tibetan Buddhist, but he was a very good photographer. And so because he knew me, he tended to take the bride's always very special at weddings. Everybody wants to kiss the bride because they're magical. And so outside the church, we were married in church. All the people from all the walks of my life, from childhood through university, all they were all there. And so he took a picture of me greeting each one of these people, and when I came to stick them in an album, which one sort of does, I was absolutely astonished because I saw that I looked like each person I was greeting. So there was a kind of resonance that happened between us, in this sort of heightened moment where if they smiled upwards, I smiled upwards. If they looked wonkily, I looked wonkily. If they smiled down, so there was an absolute resonance between them. So humans resonate with each other. That's why you look like your cat or your dog.
Well, I think that what you're saying in that situation is also a pure love situation, right? There was a celebration. So you tend to sync with a person more quickly, I would say, when the love frequency's there and you're happy and the other person's happy. It seems you can instantly meld.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. Mm-hmm.
What would you say, Jill? Are we made of sound? If matter is just vibrating energy, can you take that a step back and say that we are all just living sound?
Well, we're certainly all vibrational. I mean, everything is the regularity and the periodicities of movement. So I suppose if you kind of change the frequency of everything, then ultimately it becomes sonorous. And this is a completely fundamental principle of the universe, and then of course resonance, which means to resound, that comes with that. So, and if we're unhealthy, then I think these resonances are disturbed, which is why using our voices, which is a conscious way of making sound, for this purpose, we can, physically heal ourselves because we're inducting order into the system, consciously and on all different sort of levels, really.
Well, that makes me think of how you have said in the past that the voice is the interface point between the mind and this physical dimension, the body.
Yes, I mean, the sound is definitely the interface between sound and body, and the Tibetans talk about body, voice, or speech and mind. So there are three parts of the body in a sense. The physical, the sonorous, which mediates between the physical and the spiritual. In this case, the heart is the spiritual, the mind is the heart. So it's a little different from the Western notion of the mind being the spirit. So and if I do that, if I interrupt the continuity of your experience, and then if I speed it up, we get rhythm. And, if I speeded it up even further, we have what the harmonics of the sound, which are the internal amount of sound, the internal aspects of sound. And then if I do this, and then, maybe half an hour later, that's duration. And then if I, this is rhythm, speed it up, it becomes a note, speed it up further, it becomes harmonics, and then slowed down, it becomes duration. So music, all music is made up of counting, which is quantitative. But what happens as a result of that is purely qualitative. So quite uniquely, sound is both quality and quantity, which are normally inimicable. You know, they're two entirely different worlds which don't relate to each other. But the key thing about sound is they do relate, because sound is counting. You know, everything about sound, music is counting, and yet the effect of sound is completely ephemeral.
Isn't that interesting how it affects us? Do you think, or have you been exposed to science that shows that sound has a biochemical effect, releasing things like dopamine in the brain or serotonin? And then
definitely, yeah. Oxytocin. Dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins. I mean, there's no question about it that sound has very similar effects to taking certain kind of plant substances. Only what's interesting for me about it is you don't have to externalize the means of transformation and then re-ingest it, which you do with substances. You allow it to come from inside. And there's no question that these happy chemicals, as they're known, are affected by sound and by chanting. And also I once had a man in one of my sound workshops, and at the very end of the workshop, he stood up and he said, "This is so interesting. I'm a brain physiologist, and in fact, he was what's known as a Parkinsonian. He worked with people with Parkinson's, and he said, 'You're vibrating the brain.' So I said, well, yes, we are indeed vibrating the brain. And he said, well, that's what we do with electric shock treatment. And I thought, oh my God, so I suggested very gently, I said, well, perhaps this is a more benign way of vibrating the brain. I perhaps shouldn't say, but anyway, it seems to me that is what we're doing. We're vibrating. So we're not only, stimulating all these chemicals to flood, our brain, but we're vibrating the brain in very interesting ways. In fact, with the harmonic chant or the overtone chanting, we're actually using the tongue to push the sound right up into the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. So, which we don't really understand anyway. So we're doing very interesting things, and then we're using the tongue, and the tongue is like an extrusion of the brain. It's that part of the brain with the most direct connections to the cerebral cortex. And so when you use your tongue, it's like you're kind of manipulating the brain. In fact, a poet asked me if they did my workshop, and they said, could they say that the tongue was the visible part of the brain, and if you hold it still, you can't think? So I said, yes, you can use that as artistic license.
That's incredible to think about how much we haven't discovered about the body's functions and the synchronicities and with our energetic body. And that's one thing I'd like to ask you about is with sound, these sounds vibrate at different frequencies. We perceive them as higher tones or lower tones, but they seem to affect our energy centers, our chakras. Can you talk about how different frequencies affect our chakras and how they can help heal us?
Yes, in a sense, the problem with frequencies, they can be very arbitrary, and for example, when orchestral musicians tune before a concert, they tune to concert A, and what frequency A has changed over the years. So it used to be much lower. It used to be 432 hertz. In fact, there are a lot of people who still think that that's what it should be, and then it was speeded up actually by the Americans after the war, and they fixed it, because originally it varied. So in the 18th century, if you played a concert in one country and then another, you'd have to change the pitch. And so as people began to travel, they had to fix it, and so the Americans came in and then they fixed it much higher at 440. And then in some cases, von Karajan, I think, made it 442 even when he was recording with the Berlin Philharmonic, because it sounds brighter. So pitch is what pitch we pitch at is kind of, in a sense, it's not fixed. So I'm much more interested in resonance and the harmonics. So for example, in relation to these different centers of subtle energy, or chakras, as we've come to call them after the Indian system, the Sanskrit word chakra, which means wheel. So I'm much more interested, rather than changing the pitch, which again, it's arbitrary because, depending on which scale we're using, because how we divide the octave is a cultural agreement. So, whether you use the Balinese scale or the Western scale or the pentatonic scale or the Indian scales or the tempered scale. And one of the things that happened to the scale in the 17th century was it was tempered. So the real trueness was distorted for reasons we can talk about later. So changing the pitch is a tricky thing, because how you change the pitch depends on the agreement of the culture that you're participating in. However, one of the reasons I teach overtone chanting is because we chant on a single note, and by changing the shape of our resonant cavity, we and containing the sound so it's allowed to resound, which is what resonance means, we are able to hear, by amplifying, by making louder, the sounds of resonance, which create themselves, if you like, out of the sound that we're making. So when you do that, you hear a drone, and then you hear other flute-like sounds floating above the fundamental note or the drone that you're making. And these can only be in tune because, they have to do with the geometry of the body and the geometry of the world that we live in, that we inhabit. So these are not arbitrary. And this is one of the reasons why, when I'm teaching the voice, I use the overtone chanting rather than adopting, the Western tempered scale or some other kind of scale which is arbitrary. And it's the same with the chakras. When I'm working with people's centers of subtle energy, which I do, then rather than have people go up a scale or visualize the colors of the rainbow, which again is Newtonian, I have people chant on a single note but change the vowel. And when you change the vowel, you're changing the loudest frequency of the harmonics, or the resonance. And this is making the geometry of the body audible. It's something completely fundamental. And these harmonics aren't cultural. They have to do with the world that we live in. They're the fundamental geometry of nature, of this world down here.
Yes, you would say natural harmonics. And like you said, you did develop overtone chanting yourself. This is something you intuited. Do you feel like you channeled any of it? Like it was coming from somewhere else?
No, I think that overtone chanting existed in two different. It existed in Central Asia, so countries like Mongolia, the country which used to be called Tuva. Well, it's not. It used to be an individual country in Siberia, and Tibet. These countries had a form of chanting where you chant on a single note and you amplify the harmonics, overtone chanting. So I got it through studying with the chant master of the Gyuto monks.
Okay.
But also I was living and working with the German composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen in Köthen in the early 70s. And he created electronic music out of nothing, out of sine waves, generating sine waves and creating music long before computers existed or any instrument for doing that. He created electronic music. That was the thing he did. And so he discovered harmonics as one of the parameters of sound. I think perhaps some people have known about it, but he actually composed a piece of music called Stimmung for 6 singers, doing a very simple form of harmonic chant, based on his discoveries through creating sound out of nothing. And so this he wrote this piece in 1968. Stimmung, and I went to live and work with him in 71. And so he just fairly recently written that piece. And the first thing that we did when I went to live with him was we toured with that piece all over all over East Coast Canada and the States. So I had these 2 inductions, one through this archaic tradition of the Tibetan tradition, which I'd been studying for a long time, and also through the modern music, art music tradition directly from Stockhausen. So they, this form of chanting existed But what I did was I adopted it and adapted it as a powerful meditation. So the interesting thing about this chant, actually, when I had a friend who was doing her thesis in ethnomusicology at Cambridge, I think she was doing it in the 60s, and she was studying this form of chanting from Mongolian, from Buryat and Buryati land, and she said it was not related to shamanism. It was not shamanic. And what's so interesting about that was, at that point in time when she was doing it, shamanism was the last bastion, in a sense. It was beyond the pale. It was okay to be Buddhist, it was okay to be Hindu, it was okay to be, anything, but it was not okay to be a shamanic or a shaman. Shamanism was really beyond the pale. But since that time, shamanism has become incredibly popular, largely through people like Michael Harner in California, who was an anthropologist who made it popular. And he even took this form of, various forms of shamanism back to Tuva, which is kind of interesting, hubris of California. But anyway, he did that. And so what happened was that the shamanic tradition of Central Asia was revitalized by being approved of by the West, that this is a strange way that life works. So they got the big stamp of approval from the West. And so suddenly shamanism became popular again. So now, if you go to Mongolia or Tuva and you ask them about this form of chanting, which they do, is it shamanic? And they'll say, of course it's shamanic. But when she was doing her thesis, they'd say, no, of course it isn't.
Interesting.
So, you get the answer you deserve at the time you ask it.
But what do you think? Do you think it's shamanic? I mean, intuitively, I feel like it is, of course, because you're tapping into ethereal divine worlds.
Oh, it's definitely shamanic. I mean, what you're doing is, the fundamental that you're chanting is like the sound of this world. And then the harmonics that you hear are like the world of the spirits, the voices of the spirits. So there's no question that it's a shamanic technique. Yeah. So
would you say, though, as a student of all this, that as humans, our life, our collective lives, is this just one song? Is this just one performance that we're all doing together? We're just singing constantly as we speak our voice. Is it just one big song?
Well, I haven't quite understood the question. Is what one big song?
Life, our realities,
life,
this dimension, the third dimension, our human experience. Is it just one song that we're singing together?
Well, it's quite a complex song, if so. I mean, it's it's full of all kinds of different. I mean,
what, brown notes or?
yeah. I remember actually. There's a wonderful story about Lorca, the Spanish poet Lorca. And he was talking about lullabies, and he pointed out that the words of lullabies are all about death and destruction. So you get both and yet when you hear sad songs, you feel happy. So in a way, they're all bound together: happiness and sadness, and that's the world we live in. So maybe it is all one.
Well, it of course has an incredible crescendo coming up as we evolve into a higher version of ourselves. But in our human experience, especially here in America, we have a culture based around music, but it's commercial music. A lot of people go to rock concerts or concerts of various types of music. But here in America, there's this underground culture. And it was started by the band The Grateful Dead in the 60s, which carried into the 90s. But after Jerry Garcia died, it continued with other bands. And it is a ritualistic experience where people go to these concerts and they take psychedelic substances, whether it's plant medicines or chemicals like LSD or MDMA or even DMT. They go to these concerts to have these ritualistic experiences and focus their spiritual psychedelic energy on one point. And then what happens is during these experiences, people talk about having a unified mind, a collective mind, one mind, where the music the crowd, tens of thousands of people, in some cases close to 100,000 people, were all collectively sharing this experience. What do you think about that as a student of sound, as a person who studied these things and the healing aspects? What do you think about that particular ritual?
Well, I think sound and the substances that you take on these occasions both have the effect of reducing the normal chattering mind, the default mode network, as it's come to be known as, which just occupies most of our attention most of the time. The eating, shitting, what's going to happen tomorrow? Am I good enough? Or all this kind of nonsense that occupies us. And so both chanting and plant substances, DMT, MDMA, or any of these things, reduce that so that we are able to experience a kind of oneness. And when you combine the music with the plant substances, then it's increased even more. So the thing about using the voice is, as a meditation or as an induction into presence, which is what brings about this sense of unity, is that it allows you to. So it's one about the thing about the chanting is when you're chanting, it's not enough to chant. You have to listen to yourself chanting when you're chanting. So you're creating a circuit of attention. You're absorbed in the thing that you're actually doing. And this is what plant substances help you to do, because they get rid of this default mode network, this
right.
DM default mode. Let's call it default mode.
Sure.
So that it gets rid of all the kind of rubbish and the chattering mind, and it allows you to focus on the sound itself. And this is the essence of working with the voice. Except that we do it without taking plant substances. But so the combination of sound and plant substances makes it easier in a way. But I tried to do it with just the sound itself, because I like the idea of not having to obtain something externally in order to bring about these changes, because we have our voice, and just a question of using it differently in order to achieve the same things. But when you combine it with these plant substances which have the same kind of effect, then it's very immediate, and people do have this collective. You do tap into a collective. There's so much about the mind that we don't understand. When I do this, I just finished a family constellation workshop, because part of my work is working with inherited traumas.
Yes.
With people. And the thing about that, how that works, is that the naive representatives, so people who are in the group, are chosen by the person working to represent their family members, for example, if that's what they're working on. And so I might say to you, be my Father James, and then you would immediately, if you dropped away all that stuff that we're talking about, without trying to be him, you would find that you became him. And this is utterly mysterious, that people have the ability to tune in to some completely other way of knowing, which is utterly profound and always present. But because of all this junk and confusion, we don't notice it. So it's a question of stopping and allowing ourselves to be present with it. And then it's there. And so the occasions that you're describing, it's heightened by the combination of the sound and the substances, so that everybody is able to experience it as together.
Yes, but were you aware that this was going on here in America? It does happen in England somewhat in the rave culture, the electronic music. We were talking about electronic music and the electronic music culture of Europe, but here in America, it's within the context of our Burning Man culture and also this American jam band culture. Is that interesting to you, that these rituals are happening where people know to do this and there's tens of thousands of these people in certain situations? Is that interesting to you?
Absolutely, yes. I know I'm from England, but we do know a thing or two.
Yeah, well, you do have an incredible scene over there. There is much going on. It's just the American jam band psychedelic scene doesn't really carry over to Europe so much. It's kind of localized.
Yeah, well, I mean, the psychedelic scene is huge here.
Yes.
It's absolutely huge, and I have friends who are right at the leading edge of this, and who have a whole foundation which is trying to make much of it legal. So, there are some parts of it which are way ahead here in that respect, although it's less legalized here than with you. But
right. Yes, here in Oregon, it's pretty much legal.
Yeah, it's legal in a lot of places in the States, and I think Germany is going to legalize it, and Luxembourg, I think, but we're a bit behind on that score. But there's a huge interest, and my son Merlin Sheldrake just has written a book called Entangled Life a year ago, which is an absolute bestseller, which is about the whole fungal universe, and of course that touches on.
Oh, really?
Psychos, yeah.
I think we'll need to have him on the show then. He sounds like an incredible guest. I'll have to ask his mom though. Let's see what she says. So your ancestral healing work, and over 45-year career, you were a pioneer, and now people talk about it quite a bit. It seems to be in New Age metaphysical circles something that is a current focus. But you were talking about this early on. But what does this mean? This ancestral healing work?
Well, what I discovered was many years ago. As part of my sound work, I started to have people to honor their ancestors with sound, with the voice, going back through, the direct female line to the mothers. The interesting thing about the direct female line is each woman has given birth to the next one, which is quite extraordinary, and you can't get that with the male line because of lots of hiccups on the way that we don't know about. But anyway, I have people go back through the female line and the male line, and even though they don't know the names at a certain point. And so this is what I started with. And I found that when you started to honor your ancestors, people's lives changed in quite dramatic ways, because the ancestors have a job description. The whole point about the ancestors is that they are there to help the living remain alive, and you get this in many different traditions, particularly in the Far East, Japan and China and so on. But we've kind of forgotten about it, except we have and we haven't, because we have these armistice ceremonies, services, at the end of the war. I don't know whether they have them in the States, which celebrate the end of the war and the war dead. And as part of those services, the words are, "We will remember you," talking of the dead, "we will remember you." So what's interesting about that is that societally we know that the dead need to be remembered. That's very interesting. So the dead, which you have to be dead to be an ancestor, by the way, and but you have to know that you're an ancestor. And so sometimes people come to me and they say, my father's just died, da da da. But actually, sometimes we have to tell these people who've just died that they're ancestors. They've graduated now to become ancestors. They're not just people that we miss in our lives, but they have this job to do. But they have no agency. The ancestors have no agency unless we, the living, can intercept that. So what they do is they try to get our attention by being a thorough nuisance, tripping us up and being just like clamorous children. But the moment we start honoring them, we break through, because we are living in the present, and we can break through and then empower them by acknowledging them and honoring them to be able to then look after us and become mentors and guides to us. And so this is what I discovered, that as soon as we started honoring the ancestors, that's what happened, and people's lives started changing in dramatic ways. And so then I became, more interested in much more specific ways of working. And then once I was teaching in Munich in the early 80s, and the woman who organized my workshop, she said, "This is extraordinary. Your work reminds me of a German priest called Hellinger, and Bert Hellinger. And do you know his work?" And I said, no, I don't. And then much later, I met him, and in fact he uses Rupert Sheldrake, my husband's theory, to explain the family field, the knowing field and so on. So he's no longer living, sadly, but so I got to know him very well. He became a great friend of ours and used to visit us regularly, and I worked with him, and I found great similarities in the work that he was doing to the work that I'd also sort of pioneered. And so I was also then very influenced by him. So my work kind of collided with his in a way. And but for me, I find it's very important to use sound and ceremony as well. So when I'm doing this work, I do it ceremonially, and I use sound between each person chanting and so forth. Because the thing about using ceremony is that you have a witness. When you go somewhere and do something to change yourself, which is why people do all this stuff, because they think they're going to be better or kinder or more enlightened or whatever. So you don't do any of this stuff unless you sort of want or think you can change. But when you do that, when you go back into your community, they don't know you've changed. So they kind of they react and interact with you in the way they always did, and so you naturally go back to how you were. But when you're working ceremonially, the people around you witness you going from A to B and then treat you as B rather than A. And so this is completely, so your societal context reacts to you as having changed rather than pushing you back into the you that you used to be. And so working ceremonially for me is absolutely the crucial, part. And so when I do this work, I do it ceremonially and I use chant.
Well, it sounds like the frequency shift that happens in a person sticks, like you said, from B to A or A to B when you have people resonant around you that acknowledge it. And then when you have that recognition, it sticks. But I did want to back you up a little bit, because you said that until we acknowledge the ancestors in our lives and give them space, that they do things to trip us up. And I want you to elaborate on that a little bit more. Like, what are some of the things that they do to trip us up? Do you mean like in the third dimension? Like maybe you'll misplace your keys, or like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, all kinds of trickery. I mean, things that, our life just doesn't quite work out. We just got to miss things and miss timings of things and, don't meet the people we're supposed to meet. Who knows? I mean, just life not working out for us.
I see.
And as soon as you start acknowledging the ancestors, life starts, it just flows along and everything happens in the right time and space, and you meet the right people and the right things that you aspire to happen. And so, it's changing from sort of limping along with a broken engine and roaring along with a vehicle that works.
So essentially, the symptoms that people have in their life, maybe they feel like they're not as successful as they could be, or maybe they don't understand why these things that you just described keep happening to them. You're saying if they make space for their ancestors, they get in touch with their family field and recognize them, and they get that recognition that could correct itself.
Absolutely, but I take it much further, and so I work with them, but definitely yes. But I work with them much further, so that I do this work so that they choose people to represent their family members, and then when I'm doing it in face to face, then they lay them out, they arrange them in a kind of tableau, and then I see what's going on and interact with them it's really seeing the family and ancestors through time and through space, which normally we don't do. Normally our experience of our parents is, were we good enough? Were we better or worse than our sibling? That's about it. Whereas when you do this work, because you're moving the family members around, and when I'm doing it online, which is what I'm doing now because of the pandemic, I use little figures, and I have a whole window for that. And so you see the whole family from above. And so when you do that, you see the family through time. You see how, the trauma several generations ago is passing on from one person to the next until the person who's working. Because unless you see that and correct it, it'll go on down the generations. And so this way we're able to see what is coming down through the generation. So anything that's missing, that's forgotten, that's disliked, disowned, dishonored, anybody who's been an abuser, anybody who's done dodgy dealings, injustices, we tend to push them out of the field and have nothing to do with them. But then if we do that, they're out there making trouble, and we feel guilty because we've done that, and we punish ourselves, and they're out there, being a nuisance even more because they're not in their rightful place. So this work is about integration. It's about, honoring these people and bringing them back in such a way that they actually take their place within the field. And it's an induction of order. And when everybody's in their rightful place, especially these people who've been quite dodgy in our lives, they don't make trouble anymore because they feel honoured and respected and, and in their rightful place. And that and then they look kindly on the living or on the other members of the family. So it's an induction of order.
So, but even if you don't agree with the choices that family member may have made, you can even think of murder or God only knows, you still give them the respect and the rightful place in the family field.
Absolutely, you have to, because, if they've done some huge injustice, if they've murdered somebody, for example, they have to be integrated, so that in a sense, the worse they've been, the more you have to honor them and bring them back, and because then you're defusing them and changing the whole balance of the field, and integrating it. So absolutely, yeah. And sometimes that's an interesting process because, when you have somebody facing somebody who's abused them, it'll take a while for them to be able to say something like that to them. But when they do, everything changes. It's like a magic wand.
Yeah, it seems to restore the coherence of the field. It seems to bring that back into a functional order that then does the work that it needs to do, your lineage, your family energy?
Yes, I mean, order is what it's about. It's bringing order into the field because order is a kind of love, So when you reintegrate the field in that way. So one of the things that happens when I do this work, which is fascinating, in the middle of a workshop, say it's a weekend, somebody will come back on the second day and say, "You're not going to believe this, but I was staying." One example was this woman. She was staying with her mother. She lived outside London, and I was working in London. And she came back the second day. "You're not going to believe this." They always said that. "You're not going to believe this." But that's the sort of classic. And she said, "My mother's been estranged from her 6 brothers and sisters for 25 years. And while we were working yesterday, they all telephoned her." So, So there's a kind of bringing back into the field that happens. People have been forgotten and abandoned, excluded. Everybody, the human condition is and you see this with children, is the need to belong. You see it in the playground, the need to belong, even if what we want to belong to isn't that healthy. We need to belong. And so everybody needs to belong in the rightful place in the field. And so anything that's forgotten, excluded, disliked, dishonored, disowned, forgotten, rejected, has to be reincorporated with, as you say, with cohesion. Coherence has to be inducted into the field.
I see. So how far back in our family history can some of these incidents lie? What if they're unknown? Like, what if they go so far back that there's no one that remembers them and there's no record of the situation, but yet it's still in the family field? How do we address that?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously things go back, a long time. We have ancestors, a lot of ancestors going back. But there's always something within kind of living memory that needs working on. And also just on the edge of living memory. So, things manifest in very, very interesting ways. And the thing is that when you have somebody who's created a dynasty, so if you happen to be of a family where somebody made good, they went from rags to riches and they created a fortune, an empire or a dynasty or whatever, then what happens is that the people who were sacrificed in the making of the fortune, the descendants of that person suffer in the same way. And this is very interesting to see. I've seen it again and again and again. People who've created a kind of dynasty based on the purveying of alcohol, for example. then, like the Kennedys, for example. So then you find that the descendants are highly susceptible to addiction of different kinds, or mental illness related to the distortion of water, drowning, all that kind of thing. So you see these patterns going on down the generation. So the descendants tend to suffer in the way that people. So when somebody makes a big fortune through making railroads or building bridges, some people fall into the concrete. The people die on the way, or the slaves, for example, colonialism. I mean, there's so much dodginess in all of our history. And people, then descendants of these people, tend to suffer in the way that people were sacrificed. And so part of the work is seeing what in these kind of families is making good. And that's fascinating. I see it again and again.
It's quite interesting that this translates, but it's something that's beyond genetics, right? This is like in an energetic field, similar, I guess, to the Akashic records. Is this some sort of subfield to the Akashic field, or what do you think about that?
Well, we don't know. I mean, it's come to, before Darwin and before all thought of the inheritance of acquired characters as it was known. But, when I worked with Maurice Wilkins, who discovered DNA, at that time, everything was thought to be in the DNA. Now we know it's nonsense. It's not in the DNA. So the hot new science in the life sciences is epigenetics, which is the inheritance of acquired characters again, things that we've acquired in our lifetime that are passed down to our descendants. And we know that from studying people who are caught up in all kinds of famines, like the famine in Sweden in the 19th century, or in Holland after the war, in the 40s, or in Ireland, or the racial traumas of the Holocaust. What we now discovered is that the descendants of these people are not only have mental afflictions and mental disturbances, but they have physical and chemical changes. And so there's a lot of work now being done in what's now called epigenetics. However, a lot of the materialistic sciences are trying to are desperate to make it a material thing, what turns on the genes on and off. They're trying to find material ways to explain it, which is incredibly evasive, because, I'm quite sure it's energetic in some form. And sure, my husband thinks it's his theory of morphic resonance. So, I'm sure it's not physical in the way that people are materialistic scientists are desperate to try and make it. I mean, there's one very interesting story about the inheritance of fear in mice, which was done at the university in Atlanta about 7 years ago. And what they did was they exposed a mouse or mice to a very innocent smell of something called acetone phenone while giving them an electric shock. And then they bred the mice in vitro deliberately so that the mice wouldn't have any physical contact with their children or grandchildren or descendant mice. And they then found that the children and the grandchildren mice were terrified of the smell. So this is utterly bizarre. We have no means of knowing this, but science is in a sense catching up with this work. So this is the hot new science of epigenetics. Yeah,
it's quite interesting. It seems like there's some sort of cloud. We talk about cloud computing and we use these technological metaphors, but it seems that there's this cloud where we store our experiential information as a family, as a genetic line. Somehow there's this field of information that we can access and we can also upload to, whether we have a traumatic experience or perhaps an experience that's incredibly enlightening. We can upload that to this family field, this cloud of information, and it's there. And when a individual living in the third dimension has an experience and needs to know information that's related to the experience, but doesn't have any personal experience, they then intuitively or perhaps subconsciously pull from that cloud to help them decide. It's really interesting how it all works.
Well, I think this, you were talking about the Akashic records earlier. I mean, that's one name for it, or the karma, or the collective unconscious. I mean, lots of people have tried to give names for this, or the knowing field, or the family and ancestral field. I mean, I think there's definitely some kind of a field that we can access, and this work with family constellations allows us to access it and trust it. I mean, the thing about this process of getting in touch with this greater knowing, which we all have, there's no doubt about it, is that we have to get rid of all the junk that gets in the way of it, to allow us to dig deep down, drill down into the deep unconscious and make tap the wisdom that's there, which we know is there, but we don't know how it's there or where it is, and so we use all these metaphors. Field is a kind of metaphor for the soul in a way. It's a bounded territory based on the idea of a field. So we're struggling with names for these things. It's just a question of names, but there's definitely something there which we are able to make contact with in some strange and mysterious way. And whenever I do this work, I see it unfolding before my eyes.
Oh, I'm sure time and time again over the decades. And there's just information moving back and forth from that ethereal place to this dimension through the conduit of that person. But I do want to ask you, what about our collective ancestral field? I mean, is there a unified ancestral field? Because all humans are related. We're really just one big family, right? So isn't the human race just one big constellation?
Well, I think so, but I mean, there are also, there are racial constellations. I mean, in the West, we tend to be following salvation history, which is the story of Abraham. This is the Western story, and this is a very interesting story. And when the Twin Towers came down, I became particularly interested in it because I realized that Osama bin Laden was the a disfavored youngest son of a very sort of wealthy man, friend of Reagan and so forth. But he was the most disfavored child of the most disfavored wife. And so I began to, I realized that he had resonances with Ishmael. So the story of Abraham is very, very interesting, which is it's a story of the West. It's quite consciously the salvation history that we're following in the West. So Abraham is told to go to the promised land, if you remember. And so he leaves his father, who becomes a kind of heretic, I suppose, in Ur, and he starts off by marrying his sister, who's called Sarah at the time. And so he goes off with so the very first thing in this story is incest. This is the cultural history. So he marries his half-sister, she's his half-sister, and off they go towards the promised land, which they're going to inherit. And except that they don't get there because there's a famine, so they're forced into Egypt. And Abraham says to Sarah, it'd be better for me if you say you're my sister. And he sells her to the Pharaoh as a concubine. And then when all hell is let loose in Egypt, the Pharaoh realizes that maybe this has something to do with it. So he sends them packing with lots of goodies of slaves and which were a good thing at the time, and herds of animals and lots of prizes, and off they go again. And then they approach another kingdom, the kingdom of Abimelech, the king, and Abraham, again, this is all in Genesis, and it says to Sarah, she was then, it'd be better for me if you say you're my sister, and tries again. And Abimelech is much too wise and realizes this isn't the best way, and sends them packing again. And meanwhile, Sarah is supposed to have had a child who's going to inherit the promised land, but she's already about 90, so it's not looking good. And so she says finally to Abraham, you better sleep with the Egyptian serving girl, Hagar, and have a child that way, which was accepted at the time, which is what happened. And so Hagar gets pregnant, and then Sarah gets really jealous and banishes them to the desert, and so sends her off pregnant to the desert to hope she's going to die because she gets jealous. And then an angel comes to Hagar and says, don't worry, go back, you'll have a child who's going to be a wild and a hairy man at war with his brothers. That's very prescient. So she goes back and has Ishmael. And then 15 years later, Sarah gets pregnant. So God knows how old she is by now. And so she then says to Abraham, get rid of Ishmael, who's now 15. And so Abraham reluctantly, it says, takes Ishmael and his mother, Hagar, out into the desert to die and abandons them in the desert with a skin of water and a pita bread. But what happens is where they are left, a spring comes up called the Zamzam spring, and that becomes Mecca. And so where they are left, the disfavored firstborn child is left, becomes the center of the Islamic world. And then meanwhile, the second born, Isaac, becomes the head of the Judeo-Christian world. And they've been at war ever since. So this is
Wow.
it's the story of development, of evolution, of upwards and onwards, of going from here to there, like Western music, which is a dance, or language, which goes from here to there. It's the story of the West. Chinese writing goes backwards, ours goes forward. So everything in the West is going from here to there, and this idea of evolution and development, which is crazy, which is the basis of the ecological disaster. But this is the story. This is the story we're following. This is salvation history for you.
Wow.
So we're one big family, but we also have tribes, and this is a tribal warfare that's been going on for 4,000 years.
Well, it seems like it's in our ancestral history. It seems like there was a family trauma way back when, which in a microcosmic sense, which is now showing up thousands of years later as this macrocosmic cultural strife and struggle.
Absolutely. I mean, and at the time of the Twin Towers, I did the constellation of Abraham because I saw I saw how it was related to what had just happened with Osama bin Laden, and it was really interesting because the person who represented Ishmael, the disfavored child who was the father of the Muslims and the Arabs, was completely, in this constellation that I did, was completely catatonic. He was speechless. He couldn't speak. And so, I saw that this, the Twin Towers was a sort of, a desperate attempt to be heard.
It seemed that way. It seemed like a cry, but depending on your perspective of where you were at as a human, it could be a cry for help, a cry for attention in the greater sense as a symbol.
Yeah, I think it was, as far in, if you look at it through their eyes, that's exactly what it was. If you look at it through the eyes of somebody at the receiving end, it's very different.
Yes.
But that's the thing about the family constellation. You see what happened through the eyes of multiple members, because we have one viewpoint. We see it through our own eyes, through our own viewpoint. But with the family work, you see it through the eyes of multiple members, and they're all true. I mean, there's this. This is what's so extraordinary, that they are all true. So all the different versions of reality are all simultaneously true. And there's this wonderful, very kind of classic film called Rashomon, made by Kurosawa, and I think it was in 1950, which was the classic manifestation of this, of what I'm saying, where there's something happens. There's a samurai and a woman riding a horse and a woodsman. There were three protagonists in this film, and somebody dies, the film shows what happens through the eyes of the samurai, through the eyes of the woman, and through the eyes of the woodsman. And each has an entirely different version of what happened, and they're equally valid. And I seem to remember, being Japanese, I've got a feeling that everybody thought they'd done the murder, but anyway, I can't remember that.
But then that is part of this therapy, like you said, seeing through their perspective in order to gain a level of healing that then goes back to the family field.
Exactly, because if you can see it through the eyes of everybody, then that's what's so interesting. And sometimes I have multiple members of the same family, not always, but just sometimes. I remember once I had three sisters, and one sister who'd worked with me before, and she brought along the very vulnerable sister and the very sort of disbelieving sister, and then I worked with each of them, and you would not know it was the same family because different people have completely different versions of reality, even the same family. And of course, then you have birth order, which is a whole other level of different experience.
I'm sure. But then you think about the 10 billion people on planet Earth. They're saying 8 billion, and there's probably more like 10. And each one of those humans, those blessed humans, has their individual perspective and story that's equally as valid. And it's this cosmic juggling act, you could say, this balancing act of all these individual universes happening at the same time.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why chanting together is so magical, because you dissolve the boundaries. So sound creates form and boundaries, and also it dissolves the boundaries it creates. You know, if you have a wine glass and you wind a wet finger around the wine glass, you can. If you have a very, very expensive wine glass, nobody wants to use them, of course. And a very true voice, you can actually shatter the glass with your voice. You know, so boundaries are dissolved using sound, and that's why when you chant together with other people, you dissolve the boundaries between you as well as the internal boundaries. And this is a very, very powerful unitive experience, you know, and so with all these multiple viewpoints, there are means for coming to oneness. So we have this, you know, we have this combination of kind of knowing that we need to be present and one, at the same time reality separates us. And so we have to, it's a juggling act between living in a world of separation, judgment, you know, I see you as separate, I like you, or I want you, or I don't, and I don't, and you know, so or knowing that there's only oneness. So we kind of know better. We know there's oneness, but we act as if there isn't. And the world that we you know act in is a world of differentiation and separation. So it's a very strange situation.
It definitely. Well, some people would say that is living a multidimensional life, is existing on each one of those layers at the same time, gathering information, the oneness layer, the separate layer, and collecting that information together and forming your perspective and your reactions and your outlook. Some people would say that that's living within the multidimensional perspective. But you did say that you have some recordings of some of these chants that you do. Would you like to play those for us now?
Well, I have one. I mean, I could demonstrate the overtones, and then I can play you a group doing it together. That might be the best way.
Okay, that sounds fantastic. I'm in.
So I'm going to just chant on a single note and change the shape of my resonant cavity in a way that you might possibly be able to hear other sounds higher than the sound I'm making. And I'll repeat that after I've done it to remind you of what you've just heard.
Okay.
Oh, dear. That was one note.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you for doing that. But you can feel the tonal center kind of shifting, and there's this movement up and down, though you're just holding that one note just by moving a vowel. That's really interesting for singers out there that are listening to this that have never heard of this before. This is really interesting.
Absolutely. So I'll play a group doing it together.
Okay, great.
Now. That's what I teach.
That is so powerful. Yeah, because you feel the omness, you feel the resonant universal tone, and then you feel that collective harmonic shifting, and it's very powerful.
It is. It's very powerful. It's a very, very powerful meditation technique as well, because you're pushing down the breath in a way that you do in certain yogic techniques, and the notes that you're singing are absolutely in tune, unlike the tempered scale, which all Western music is based on, where Just to describe what happened with the popularity of keyboard instruments in the 17th century, the whole tuning system had to change. So you couldn't any longer tune from one note to the fifth and so on. And so there was this, if you have a cycle of fifths, you go from one note to the next 5 notes above, 5 notes above, 5 notes above. You don't actually get to the octave above, you overlap it above the next octave, and by what's known as a quarter of a semitone, or the Pythagorean comma. And so what happened eventually, after much dispute in the 17th century, was the tempered scale, which is that this quarter of a semitone was rammed back inside the octave, with making all the intervals within the octave out of tune, but not so much that you'd notice it. So it was considered. It was a kind of Faustian bargain, we'll make all our music out of tune, and what we can do with it now. So all music since Bach has been out of tune in this way.
Right.
So but it is so little that very, very few people notice it. I mean, you have to have absolutely perfect pitch to notice it, and most musicians don't notice it. But it is a fudge, and it means we're not sound in mind and body. And so the form of chanting that I'm teaching, you are sound in mind and body, because the notes that you're making are emerging through resonance, through resounding the sound, through the natural manifestation of the your own geometry becoming sonorous, becoming heard. So it's absolutely in tune, and which means you can become sound in mind and body. Sound in mind and body means to be healthy. So the word sound is used to imply health, both in mind and in body, and rightly so.
Yeah, it seems to reorient you spiritually, physically, mentally, when you participate in this. But before we go, I do want to just get your comments on two things. There's a concept that people talk about where we exist on a certain bandwidth. In order for us to vibrate to a higher frequency of existence, to truly get to a heaven on earth scenario, we need to evolve as humans. But some people would say that because of our nature of conflict, which is often portrayed as the yin-yang symbol, that it's unattainable, it's impossible. However, the theory is that we are existing in a bandwidth like a musical scale. So you have low C and high C. And if we can raise our octave collectively, we then define low C in that existence as what we used to define as high C. And then high C is this incredibly new place. Do you think personally that that is the destiny of humans, that we can raise our octave so whatever laws are in place, the yin and the yang, we can transmute that and exist in a higher frequency together?
It depends what mood I wake up in the morning. Sometimes I'm optimistic and I think we can change and save the world, and other times I'm more pessimistic and I think we don't have a hope in hell. And it really depends. We have to hope that we can change, because if we don't, things aren't looking good. So that's why I do what I do, because I know that what I do helps people to change. Otherwise I wouldn't do it. So I must be ultimately optimistic. But when I stand back and look at the greater picture, it's tricky. Who knows? But I think, we all have to change individually. I think that's the only way that it's going to happen. That's why I do what I do. I try to help us in groups to change individually. And I think that's what we have to do.
And in your work, have you ever experienced an extraterrestrial component or an angelic component, some sort of outside consciousness that's not an ancestor, but perhaps something else?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, a divine being. I don't know. I've been hypnotized by people who believe in extraterrestrials, and I did have a strange experience once through hypnosis. But in general, these other beings that have different labels have tended to be more spiritual beings than extraterrestrials, in my experience. But I certainly think it's possible.
Interesting.
I only think so. Yeah.
Well, I do want to thank you for being on the show. I want to tell people where to find you, and I want to tell people about your upcoming workshops. So right off the bat, you can go to jillpurce.com, and I'm going to spell that for you. JILLPURCE, jillpurce.com. You can go there and you can find out what she's up to. She has 2 upcoming workshops that I want to tell you about. She has a healing voice workshop coming up February 12th and 13th. And you can find out about that on her website and, of course, Eventbrite as well. And then
it's online. Yeah, it's live streaming online.
Yes, a streaming event. So worldwide, no matter where you are, listeners in 115 countries that we're up to, you can be a part of this event no matter your time zone. It doesn't matter. It's an ethereal event, you could say. And in March, there is the Family Constellation Workshop, and you might see yours truly be a part of that one. I'm highly interested in this. That is March 18th, 19th, and 20th. So please check Jill Purce's website for more information about that. She'll be updating it and you'll see all the current information. She does have CDs available if you're interested in the overtone chanting and what you heard. She does have 2 CDs available at jillpurce.com, overtone chanting meditations and the healing voice, and her original book that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, The Mystic Spiral, is available in print. You can get that on Amazon or wherever you purchase books. And Jill, before we go, thank you again for being on. You're influencing so many people, these new souls that are coming into this information for the first time. It doesn't necessarily matter what age you are, but you're just coming into this information for the first time. You're helping these people. Is there anything you want to say before you depart our interview?
Well, just a very practical thing about the website. Sometimes people have a problem spelling my name, so you can also get to my website through a different portal, which is healingvoice.com.
Oh.
Just one word, healingvoice.com, and then there's no spelling problem. They both will take you to the same place.
Okay.
Well, I mean, just a final thing, come and work with me, come and explore the voice. I've been pioneering this for a long time, and it's a revelation, really. And also, come and clear your family lines so that you don't pass on this confusion to your descendants if you have them, or directly or indirectly. We all have to clear up our stuff because we have to change the world person by person.
Yes, that is the road. We talk about this. The road to heaven on earth is a personal road. It's the road of personal development. Jill, thank you so much for being on the show. Please hold through the outro music. And everyone, what an interview. That was incredible. I hope you participate in the workshops. You'll see me there. We'll see you next week. Midnight on Earth.